History is filled with tales of bizarre trials and strange forms of justice. But no event in the long annals of history is more grotesque, more macabre, or more unbelievable than this. This is the story of a trial where the defendant was a corpse. A formal proceeding against a man already in his grave. It is a tale of political hatred so intense it reached beyond the boundaries of life and death itself. This is the true story of the Cadaver Synod, the strangest trial the world has ever known. Our story takes place in Rome, in the late 9th century. This was not a time of holy peace. The papacy was not just a spiritual office, 'twas a political prize, a source of immense power and wealth. Powerful aristocratic families of Rome were locked in a violent struggle to control the throne of St. Peter. Popes were installed by force, deposed by their rivals, and often died violent deaths in prison. Into this brutal world stepped a man named Formosus. He became pope in the year 891. Formosus was a respected but controversial figure. He was a skilled diplomat, but also deeply ambitious. During his reign, he made powerful and dangerous enemies among the noble families of Rome. When Pope Formosus died in 896, his enemies saw their chance to seize power and erase his legacy. After a brief and chaotic succession, a new pope came to the throne, backed by the enemies of Formosus. Stephen was a weak and paranoid figure, a puppet of his political patrons. His name was Pope Stephen VI. They pressured him to take a final, ultimate revenge on their dead rival. It wasn't enough to simply annul Formosus's decrees. They wanted to publicly humiliate and destroy him. And so, Pope Stephen conceived of a truly monstrous idea: a trial against a dead man. In January of 897, he gave the order. The body of Pope Formosus was to be exhumed from its tomb. For 7 months, the corpse had been rotting in its grave. Now, it was brought out into the light. In a gruesome ceremony, the decaying body was dressed in the full, magnificent vestments of the papacy. A crown was placed on its skeletal head. It was made to look like a living pope once more. The corpse was then carried into the great basilica of St. John Lateran, the main cathedral of Rome. It was propped up on a throne, positioned to face its accusers in a formal church council or synod. The bishops and cardinals of Rome were assembled to act as the jury. A living pope, filled with rage, screaming accusations at a dead one. On the other side of the room sat Pope Stephen VI, acting as the chief prosecutor. The scene was surreal, a terrifying tableau from a nightmare. The corpse sat silent and tilting, its eyes empty, its face discolored by decay. To make the trial seem legitimate, a young deacon was appointed to be the defense counsel for the corpse. He was made to hide behind the throne, and when questions were asked, he would answer for the dead pope in a terrified whisper. The charges were read out. Formosus was accused of perjury, of ambition, and of violating church law by accepting the papacy. Pope Stephen paced before the throne, shouting at the corpse, "Why did you usurp the universal Roman Church with such ambition?" The Synod of Bishops sat in horrified silence, too afraid to oppose the powerful and enraged Pope Stephen. The outcome of this sham trial was, of course, decided from the very beginning. The terrified council found the corpse of Pope Formosus guilty on all charges. But the verdict was only the beginning of the horror. The punishment was next. Pope Stephen, in a fit of rage, ordered the papal vestments to be ripped from the rotting body. Then, he ordered a guard to take an axe and hack off the 3 fingers on the corpse's right hand. These were the fingers that Formosus had used to give blessings during his life as pope. All of his acts, his ordinations, and his decrees were declared null and void. The mutilated corpse was then handed over to a mob. This single act threw the entire church administration into chaos. Priests he had ordained were no longer priests. The desecration was not over. It was dragged through the streets of Rome, while the citizens watched in horror and disgust. Finally, the body was thrown unceremoniously into the Tiber River, and it sank beneath the waves. Pope Stephen and his faction had won. They had utterly destroyed their enemy. Or so they thought. But the people of Rome were not just angry, they were terrified. They saw this act as a terrible sacrilege. A few months later, a powerful earthquake struck Rome, badly damaging the Lateran Basilica where the trial was held. The people saw this as a clear sign of God's wrath, a divine punishment for the blasphemous Synod. Public opinion, which was already simmering, now boiled over into a violent rage against Pope Stephen. An uprising swept through the city. The people stormed the papal palace and captured Stephen. He was thrown into a dungeon, and in the summer of 897, he was strangled to death in his cell. The story of the Cadaver Synod does not quite end there. The chaos continued. According to legend, a fisherman later found the body of Formosus washed up on the banks of the Tiber and gave it a proper burial. The popes who followed Stephen struggled to clean up the mess he had created. The Cadaver Synod was officially condemned. All of its verdicts were overturned. The ordinations made by Pope Formosus were reinstated, restoring order to the Church. And finally, a new law was passed, forbidding anyone from ever putting a dead person on trial again. The Cadaver Synod stands as a chilling monument to the brutality of the era. It represents the absolute low point of the papacy, a period historians call the Saeculum Obscurum, or the Dark Age. It is a shocking example of how political hatred and personal vengeance can corrupt even the most sacred of institutions. It shows that the struggle for power can lead men to acts of unbelievable cruelty and madness. It is a story that seems too bizarre, too grotesque to possibly be true. But it is a documented historical fact, a macabre footnote in the history of Europe. It reveals the violent and deeply human power struggles that have always lurked beneath the surface. A grim reminder that even those who claim to speak for God are still, in the end, only human. The trial of the dead pope remains one of history's most powerful and disturbing cautionary tales.